Thank you everyone for joining us once again. I'm Elizabeth Voss, Editor-in-Chief of Disability Media. We're on the Unity 4J Vigil, as you all know, and I'm really honoured to be with Greg Barnes, Julian Assange's legal representative in Australia. Greg, thank you for spending the time with us today. Do you have any updates that you'd like to share?
Look, the London legal team obviously is working assiduously on this matter. Just to recap for people, the legal issues in this case, which I think are well understood, but the major, there are a few legal issues, but the major one, of course, is the UK courts wishing to deal with Julian for a breach of bail. The breach of bail involved him going into the Ecuadorian Embassy and seeking asylum. A breach of bail, excuse me, a breach of bail is not a particularly serious offence. I mean, it's a serious offence, but it doesn't carry a long jail term. Normally it's dealt with by way of fine or would be a very short term of imprisonment. And this is obviously an exceptional case. The issue which flows from that, of course, is whether or not while in detention, the United States would firstly file an indictment in the United States courts and then seek extradition from the UK. That would trigger a long battle, and I think Gareth Pearce, who leads the London team, has said that'll trigger a long battle in the courts over an extended period of time. And then the third issue, of course, which has emerged in recent days, is the idea from President Lenin Moreno and the Ecuadorian government that it could seek to renounce or cancel, to use a common term, the Ecuadorian citizenship which it gave Julian, I think late last year or early this year, and also whether or not it could, as a matter of law, revoke his claim to asylum, which it has previously accepted. If it did, I think those issues are very interesting because, as a matter of international law, it would certainly be a breach. I'm not aware of other cases where a person's asylum has been revoked. Certainly citizenship can be cancelled by countries. However, the general rule in just about every country, certainly those that subscribe to the rule of law, is that you only cancel a citizenship if a person, for example, has become a threat to that society. For example, people who go and fight for ISIS, etc. Secondly, that once a person has been granted asylum, unless it's found that that person is not who they say they are, for example, fake identity. I'm not aware of cases where governments just say, oh, well, we no longer accept your claim for asylum, having accepted it. Once it's accepted, then that triggers the processes at law to allow that person to remain within that country and protected within that country.
Yeah, so I would like to sort of ask you to almost emphasize that this would be unprecedented if Ecuador would attempt to sort of revoke his asylum. I think during the emergency event, you discussed the issue of refoulement. Can you walk our listeners through that a little bit and what that entails or how that's connected to all this?
Yeah, so refoulement, which is spelled R-O-U, that's all right. No, R-E-F-O-U-L-E-M-E-N-T. It's a difficult word. Refoulement,
there you go.
The concept in
there you go.
migration law, which essentially says that those countries that are signatories to the Refugee Convention and other conventions under international law, that a fundamental principle is you do not send a person back to the country from which they fled and from which they're seeking asylum. This case is a little bit different in the sense that this involves, of course, Julian saying there's a third country here. It's not the UK that's going to subject me to torture, but it would be en route to being tortured or subjected to cruel and unusual punishment in the United States. So it's slightly different, but there's certainly a principle of law which operates, which says that you should not refoul. Now, having said that, the Australian government, which has behaved appallingly in relation to asylum seekers, I've acted for many asylum seekers, it has in fact sent people back to Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, where there's no doubt they've either been killed or persecuted. And one of the difficulties that you're dealing with international law is the lack of enforceability. Countries subscribe to it when it suits them. and don't subscribe to it when it doesn't suit them. I think the other point to remember about the law in this particular arena is that it's inherently political. And so if I can put on my political hat as a former political advisor in this country and a political commentator, it seems to me, and the certain work we've been doing in Australia has been around a political solution to this issue. The courts can take the matter so far, and there are important principles of law at stake, but tragically, governments, particularly when it comes to international law and conventions which are not written down into law, they do what they like. And so at the end of the day, a lot of these cases get resolved at a political level.
So in that sense, then one of the really, truly important things that you'd emphasize from a legal and political perspective is the action that viewers should take in petitioning their representatives, especially if they're in Australia, to protect Julian Assange, and in the US as well. But
yeah, no, we've certainly been saying for some time the Australian government has got a constructive role to play here. The role that the Australian government can play is that Julian is an Australian citizen. He's recently applied for a new Australian passport. He has family in Australia. His mum and dad are here. I speak with them regularly. He has strong links to this country. Australia is uniquely placed because it's very close to the United States, also very close to the United Kingdom. Look, if you look at the politics of this situation, Theresa May has got enough problems without having this matter land on her desk and a groundswell of support saying, release him, don't extradite him, etc. The United States, on the other hand, is very difficult to read because the Trump administration is totally transactional. You don't know who's speaking for whom, and it's difficult to work out who believes what. Having said that, as we've seen with Trump, that sometimes means that you can get things done. Sometimes it means you can't. I mean, I think most notoriously, the sight of Kim Kardashian in the White House pleading on behalf of a convicted drug trafficker or something of that nature is something that would have been unthinkable under Obama or any other president, but it happened. So,
and that was successful. I believe that was successful. Yeah,
that's right. So who knows what's going to happen in the United States? But look, the fundamental point is that if Julian is forced to leave the embassy, courtesy of what we would say are unlawful actions by Ecuador, and I'm not sure whether or not the team is looking at actions in the Ecuadorian courts, and I don't mean any disrespect to the Ecuadorian legal system, but it hasn't been overly robust, shall we say, over an extended period. One would have thought that his best chances were in the UK court system. Just coming back to Australia, though, if he did come back to Australia, that would not stop the US making an extradition request. But one of the things that there are two issues when it comes to extradition requests that courts in Australia and the UK look at. The first is there a like offence in the statute books of the UK or Australia? I'm not sure that there is in this particular case. I don't think he's committed any offence. But even if you said, for example, that he's in possession of documents which were security documents which were stolen. Let's assume. I'm not saying this is the case. I'm just let's assume it
as a hypothetical.
That's a hypothetical. Does that make that an offence under Australian or UK law? That's problematic. But secondly, there are cases where countries such as the UK and Australia have refused to hand people over where there haven't been. They can't be satisfied that person won't be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment and or torture. So there is, in the UK courts, there would be a lengthy legal battle. I think that the difficulty with that battle would be Julian would be detained then in the UK prison system because having failed to attend bail, a UK court might take the view, I don't know, but it might take the view that, well, he failed to attend bail, he's a flight risk, as they call it, he's going to have to be detained and, he may be detained in the UK prison system for a couple of years while that extradition matter flows through the courts. If he came back to Australia, I think the matter, it would be part of some sort of solution that would allow him to return to Australia, gets out of the UK's hairs, and of course Australia takes him back as an ally of the US that would be a much needed solution. But look, there's a long way to go in it. There are a lot of imponderables, and the law is only part of the solution here, as I say.
So what is your advice on how our viewers can move forward now? I mean, obviously they should be petitioning their politicians and representatives. Is there anything else that they should do, or is there anything else they should know from a legal perspective about just the current situation?
Yeah, look, I think I've probably given you the current situation,
Yeah.
Elizabeth. For Australian viewers, I would urge you and your friends, get in touch with your local MP's office. Look, having worked in politics in Australia, while people say, oh, it's a waste of time, it's not actually. The way MPs work in Australia, and I'm sure the UK and the US is the same, once they start getting a volume of mail, and by mail I mean emails, phone calls, texts, whatever, tweets, whatever, they then start to react. Because they think, oh, that's an issue out there. You know, I'm getting lots of calls about it. It's common you hear politicians say, oh, I've acted on this, or I'm urging action on this because I'm getting a lot of my constituents concerned about it. That's when they jump, because that's votes. And so you've got to bombard them, but not in a disrespectful way, but you've just got to continue to go to them and say this is a very serious issue. And I think for Australians, there is an acknowledgement in this country, and has been for many years, that Australians think their government should assist people who, when they're overseas and get into trouble, need help. And there's a long history in Australia of governments being urged and lobbied to do that. Most famously in the case of David Hicks, who was a guy from Adelaide in Australia who ended up, I think, really quite haplessly and helplessly with bin Laden's people. He was put in Guantanamo Bay. There was huge pressure in Australia to bring him back, and he came back. And that was a Conservative government that was forced to do it. So I would urge people to use that channel, because, look, the volume speaks for itself. And when you get that volume, politicians start talking about it.
Absolutely.
Because we need, I think one of the important things in this issue is you need groundswell. And you're getting it here. You've got to translate it broadly into the community. You want this issue to be, as we say in Australia, a water cooler conversation. In other words, that if you're in your office and you go and get a glass of water from the water cooler and you're chatting to one of your work colleagues, you start talking about Julian Assange. That's what you want to happen. And that can happen. David Hicks is a case of that in Australia, where, people, the average Joe on the street was talking about David Hicks. Not because they were particularly sympathetic to Hicks, but because they thought this is really outrageous that Australia's letting one of its citizens be held in Guantanamo Bay.
Absolutely. It becomes like an issue around sovereignty and being a vassal state versus being sovereign.
Exactly right. Standing up, and look, even though I think the reality is that people in the UK and Australia quite like having an alliance with the United States, I think that most smart people, and I think the average punter thinks that there have to be limits. That you don't just allow your citizens to be sent over there and to be subjected to. And there's no doubt Julian would be subjected to the sort of cruelty that Chelsea Manning had to endure.
Absolutely. I think Caitlin Johnstone kind of makes fun of Australia's obedience to the US by calling Australia the US's basement gimp. I thought that was a pretty humorous way of putting it.
Very critical of the Australian, the way Australia conducts itself in relation to the United States. Very critical, and a lot of Australians are critical. But just talking to people on the street here, a lot of people just think there needs to be a resolution. You can't stay in the embassy forever, shouldn't be sent to America. There needs to be a resolution. And that's the message you've got to get through. Australia can play a constructive role. Having said that, I'll say this in defence of the current government in Australia, which I'm not a great supporter of, but the current government of Malcolm Turnbull is not hostile to Julian Assange. The previous Labor government of Julia Gillard and Foreign Minister Bob Carr was extremely hostile to Julian Assange. Gillard thought he'd committed offences under Australian law, which was nonsense. Carr ignored him when he was Foreign Minister. Julie Bishop, as current Foreign Minister, and Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, do not have a hostile view of Julian Assange. It's interesting, viewers might like to know Malcolm Turnbull's background was that in 1989, he famously defended a guy called Peter Wright, who was ex-MI5, who'd written a book about his time at MI5. The UK government tried to stop the publication of the book. Turnbull went to court and won. It was called the Spycatcher case. So he's got history around, truth and revealing truth. Julie Bishop has enabled in recent times the Australian High Commission in London to go to see Julian, to fill out his passport papers. John Shipton, Julian's dad, and I have been to see the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and got a very good reception. I mean, more needs to be done, but I would urge people to take a different view and to encourage the current government in Australia rather than criticising them, but actually encouraging, because they do not have that hostile approach. And the other point I'd make is there's been a lot of aggressive rhetoric about Julian. Jeremy Hunt, the UK Foreign Secretary, Mike Pompeo in the US, etc. It's notable Australia hasn't joined in that rhetoric in recent times. That is notable. I mean, they haven't defended Julian, but on the other hand, they haven't joined in when they could have joined in, and I think that's notable.
And we also know that that Assange actually had a visit recently from Australian officials in the UK as well, under Malcolm Turnbull's government. I've also heard that Malcolm Turnbull was supportive of WikiLeaks before becoming Prime Minister. Is that right? Or is...
Yeah, look, he was, and I had discussions. I know Malcolm going back to my days running a campaign to try and make Australia a republic. He and I worked on that together, and so I've known him for a long time. And he certainly, and I remember talking to him during that period, and he certainly is much more sympathetic. I mean, as I say, he's got a history of this. He did that big case for Peter Wright, and he's extremely sympathetic to it. So what happened there? Anyway, he's extremely sympathetic to it. I'd urge people in Australia, but even people from overseas, if you want to get in contact with the Prime Minister's office and the Foreign Minister's office, do it. This is an international issue about an Australian, and they need to know that the world is watching.
Absolutely. That is an incredible point. Definitely. And I think one thing that I've noticed that Julian Assange has absolutely called out for multiple times is people on the ground, but also, as you're saying, to get in touch with politicians and representatives loudly and vocally as much as possible. Yeah,
no, look, it's very true. And I mean, you do it in a way that, as I say, is respectful, but firm, making a point. And it's the volume that moves politicians.
Definitely. Well, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to speak about?
Good. I've got to head off to court, unfortunately, but I appreciate, again, the work you guys are doing, because these are so important, these vigils, because they do give strength to the movement, but also it's a great opportunity for those of us who are on the team to get messages out and to discuss issues and to I think, the more people we have involved, the better we get and fine-tune our ideas on campaigning for Julian.
Thank you so much for spending your limited time with us explaining. It's an honor to speak with you. I really appreciate it, and I hope that we will see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth.